When you talk to the president, do you advise him to tone down his attacks on the Fed? Would you like to see him attack the Fed less often?
First, I don't talk to him that often, by the way. And no, I don't talk to him about what his views should be on the Fed. What I think the president wants is, I think, just plain in what he says, is he wants them to lower the discount rate, and maybe by as much as 50 basis points. And it's pretty clear that he believes that lower rates will improve the economy, increase the stock market, and increase output, employment, and production. And I would guess the Fed probably is resisting his advice, but I don't really know. I don't talk to the president about the Fed.
But on a serious note, we were just talking moments ago about President Erdogan firing his head of his central bank because they haven't cut rates, and unanimously all economists say that's a bad thing to be doing. Now, the president hasn't fired anybody at the Fed, but he is clearly putting undue pressure on them with his rhetoric. Is that advisable?
Well, I'm surprised you say unanimously by all economists, because it's really, I don't understand why the Fed is independent, to be honest. Fiscal policy is not independent. Military policy is not independent. Social policy is not. Why should monetary policy, this very powerful tool to control the economy, not be subjected to democracy just like every other instrument of government? I mean, it should be controlled by the president, by the legislative, and the executive branches. But it's not, and so therefore you get this back and forth all the time. And I'm sure the same thing is true in Turkey with Erdogan. And, you know, it's obvious that there's a difference between the executive branch and the Fed. And, you know, it's going to go on as long as the Fed's independent. You're going to get these clashes, and always have had them, by the way. When I was in the White House in 1970, 71, 72, Nixon had this real big problem with Arthur Burns all the time. And that's what goes on there. And,
do you not think credibility in the U.S. dollar and U.S. government debt would be hurt if there was not an independent central bank?
Well, there might be. It might be. I mean, that's true. I mean, is it hurt by not having independent fiscal policy? Probably. I mean, they probably raise taxes way too much and spend way too much. If it were independent, they probably would spend less and tax less, which would make me happy. But I don't think that's the essence of what democracy is. I mean, I don't think an independent Fed run by academics is really necessarily a very good thing for the country. I would like to see us go on a price rule or on a quantity rule and really take the decision-making out, much like we had prior to the Fed in 1913.
Art, I'm surprised that you invoke President Nixon's criticism of Arthur Burns as a supporting example of why the Fed should not be independent, considering the aftermath of that was stagflation. Okay, when you basically got the administration more or less getting its way in monetary policy, and I think people look back on that and say that's why you don't actually want politicians to be running things.
Well, let me just say that John Ehrlichman used me personally to go in to visit Arthur Burns back in 1970 to 72. Just the three of us in the room where John Ehrlichman would beat up on Arthur Burns, and I was supposed to be the referee. I wasn't. But Arthur Burns also was the one that pushed in wage and price controls. Now, as an independent chairman of the Fed, I think wage and price controls were a disaster for the U.S., and that was all Arthur Burns. And the one thing that he chose not to be controlled were interest rates. How's that for hypocrisy at its very highest? But that's what happens when you have an independent Fed, and a professor, basically, not someone in business, is that's that type of conflict, and Nixon did not win with Arthur Burns all the time. Far from it.
Mr. Laffer, it's Walter Isaacson. You said just a moment ago you thought maybe there should be a price rule or some, rules-based way of doing this. Would you think it makes sense, and you refer to before 1913, do you think it makes sense to go to some modern version of a gold standard or a solid standard?
Well, I don't know if it should be gold or not. It should be a commodity-based standard, I believe, or an interest rate-based standard. That would make sense as well. I wrote a piece in 1981 called Reinstatement of the Dollar, the Blueprint, which now this is back in 1981, which was, 30, 40 years ago. But what I proposed there was a dollar-gold relationship that should be looked at very carefully. It was broken under Kennedy, where we really had, if you remember, Charles de Gaulle tried to cash in his dollars for gold, and we had a real crisis in monetary policy. I think if you maintained the value of the dollar in the standards there and didn't use quantities in that, I think you'd have a much better monetary system. But this one's not bad, and this Federal Reserve Board is not a bad board. I don't want to bash this board and these people. They're good people. They're good economists. and they're doing a pretty good job. Monetary policy is not the crisis it was in 1980 and 1981, 1982, when we had crazy monetary policy.
So why then do we need to cut rates at all? We have what the president describes himself as the greatest economy that we've ever had. We have stock prices at an all-time high. Isn't the president's withering criticism and repeated criticism of the Fed the perfect reason why the Fed should remain independent? If it was up to this president, if he had control over it, who knows? Maybe he'd cut interest rates by a full point. Is that really necessary?
I don't know if it's necessary or not, but you don't want a Fed that's just baiting the president all the time. I mean, that's not the purpose of an independent group. But what you find happening with the Fed is they have followed interest rates pretty much. They, when interest rates start going way down, they lower the discount rate and respond and follow the markets. And they have not done that recently. We have the 10-year bond now at below 2%. I don't know what it is this morning.
It's
but
202,
below 2%.
But your point's taken.
Yeah, well, in that range, and it was 3. That's when they had the discount rate. We've had a large fall in interest rates, and the Fed hasn't followed the market, which it almost always does, and I believe should do. It should follow the market, and it's not done that. And I think they're just baiting the president, to be honest with you, and he's taking the bait and biting back.